Coming up today on LinkedIn News Live, what constitutes business success? We speak with one expert who says shifts in attitude and mindsets are changing the rules dramatically. Plus, the most gender-equal jobs in the U.S. What are they and where can they be found? All that and more next. Hello, I'm Caroline Fairchild, and welcome to LinkedIn News Live, where the business conversation begins with you. It's January 21st, and here's a quick look at the top headlines that are trending right now on LinkedIn. United Airlines lost $7 billion in 2020. Companies are offering vaccine incentives, and Joe Biden is sworn in as the 46th president of the United States. Let's take a deeper dive into this historic moment. With his hand on the family Bible, Joseph R. Biden was inaugurated yesterday to the highest office in the land. He has the enormous task of leading the country through a political, economic, and health crisis. In some of his first executive actions, President Biden rejoined the Paris Climate Pact, introduced a mask mandate on federal property, and ended the so-called Muslim travel ban. And shortly before President Biden took his oath, Kamala Harris was sworn in as vice president. She's the first woman and person of color to assume the role. We've seen a massive response from the business community to all these events, and we're going to bring ahead a comment that we have from Dan Schulman. He's the president and CEO at PayPal. He wrote, "All Americans can take pride in the peaceful transfer of power that took place today. Inauguration Day is a reminder of the strength and fortitude of our democracy and the immense responsibility we have to protect it. The pride that we feel today, however, must also inspire our determination to address the significant challenges that lie ahead." And for more stories like these, be sure to check out the news module to the right of your LinkedIn feed. Or if you're in mobile, you can click into that search box. The rules of business are shifting dramatically, which means how companies are thinking about purpose is shifting along with new mindsets and ideas. Is it still all about shareholder primacy? Is the balance sheet the only metric that counts? Our next guest says no, and that executives should be thinking about society first. Joining us now is Judy Samuelson. She's the founder and executive director of the Aspen Institute's Business and Society program and the author of the new book, The 6 New Roles of Business, Creating Real Value in a Changing World. Judy, welcome to LinkedIn News Live.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
All right, let's just get into it. This seems like a world away, but there used to be a time, if you can remember, I can barely remember it, when business leaders didn't want to talk about politics. They just shied away from that. What changed?
Whoa, what hasn't changed in that domain? It feels like I agree with you, it feels like a fairly radical shift. I think it's one that's been mounting for a while, and we saw evidence of it. Frankly, it started happening with increasing frequency early on in the Trump administration around the travel ban from 7 majority Muslim countries, which hit companies where they live. This became about their employees. It became personal. And one of the trends today is about the increase in employee voice. They want to hear their executive identifying with things that they believe are critical to the long-term health of their communities as well as their companies. So I think there's a lot that's been mounting there, but we have seen in the last weeks a real surge, if you will, in kind of CEO activism here.
You mentioned that a lot of employees are now demanding that their executives are speaking out on some of these issues, but that doesn't always jive with what, say, clients are thinking. So there's just this difference in terms of what they're supposed to be speaking about and making everyone happy. What leaders are doing this well?
I think there's a lot of them. One of the most difficult ones, I believe, that we've seen play out over the last years was actually Doug McMillon at Walmart. I mean, this is not a company that everybody admires, but it's a massive employer. And it's a company that's really come a long ways in kind of putting environmental issues and stuff up front. But there's not a pro and con there. But then it came down to guns. And we had those 2 horrific shootings inside Walmart stores inside of a matter of days. And of course, we know Walmart serves everyone, and they had already made a lot of decisions around what they would sell and what they wouldn't sell. But he stepped into the fray and listened to his employees again and realized that they had to complete the process of taking everything off the shelves. I think it's a stunning example.
Yeah, I can't think of a company that has more stakeholders than Walmart. Judy, I'm going to go
No.
ahead and say hello to some members who are joining us in the stream. We have Dolores from Dallas, Stephen from New Jersey, Tom from South Carolina, Ashley from Alabama, and Mazad from South Africa. Thanks for joining us on LinkedIn News Live. Judy, I wanted to get your take on some headlines that we've seen crop up this week, and in the coming weeks. We saw Amazon earlier this week announce that they're going to employees are going to vote to see if they want to unionize. And just a couple weeks ago, we saw Google form an employee union. What does this really tell us about the changing relationship between the employer and the employee as we move into 2021?
Well, of course, it's not Google forming a union; it's the Google employees forming their own union, and we'll see what the response is over time. I think it's just the events at Amazon are equally interesting. I thought what was compelling about the Google moment is that they included contractors as well. Well, if there's anything we've learned during COVID, is that we are reminded that companies really are their employees. Employees are not a so-called stakeholder. They are, in fact, the lifeblood of the enterprise. They're linked to risk and to opportunity as well. And they identify with people who are on the other side of the cubicle that don't have the same rights and the same, employment gains as they do. And so I think we're just opening up this box, and we'll have to watch and see where it goes.
And you actually refer to contract workers as one of the 3 blind spots that are holding companies back right now. You also mentioned executive pay. What are the trouble spots there?
Well, executive pay is one of those third rail issues. Nobody really wants to talk about it. The directors don't really want to bring it up. The CEO certainly doesn't want to put a spotlight on their own pay. But it's hard to imagine that change will happen just from regulatory gain. It's going to be through some discernment in boardrooms, essentially saying, what are we paying our CEO to do? This is not just about the amount. It's not just, as the market likes to call, quantum. It's not just the amount they are paid. It's also, what are they paid to do? And as long as the stock price is at the center of the conversation around pay, and that's where the rewards are, it's actually in opposition to the position that many companies have taken to put the purpose of the corporation front and center and to organize around something that's more meaningful in the public sphere.
But to play devil's advocate here, a lot of companies are still focusing on maximizing shareholder value. A lot of people would argue that they need to do that in order for corporations to even be able to put their finger on the pulse of changing society. So this shift that we're seeing, what's driving it? We talked a little bit about employees demanding it, but why? Why should companies be focused on society right now?
I think they always have been. I mean, in other words, I don't think a company lasts for more than a very short period of time that doesn't manage to multitask, right? I mean, nobody managing an enterprise as complex as the ones we've already mentioned this morning can be managing by a single objective function like stock price or profits today. It has to be more complex than that, and they have to be listening to a host of different inputs and constraints and managing with the license to operate globally, which is a very complex endeavor. So I think that what we're allowing is for those voices to be heard more, and for the complexity of managing to become more connected to what we identify the corporation to exist to accomplish.
And you talk about the complexity of management. That's something that I think became a huge issue as we think about the global pandemic that corporations had to face across the world. Let's talk a little bit about the pandemic. I'm curious how you see that accelerating trends that we've talked about. And what we've talked a lot about on LinkedIn News Live is just how much leaders have had to lead with empathy through this health crisis.
Yeah, I actually think it brings up 2 really interesting phenomenon. One, it really has humanized companies for us. And I think executives have leaned in to tell their story more about who their employees are and their commitment to their employees. At the same time, of course, we're still managing to, in some respects, shareholder primacy, and there have been moves that have gone in the opposite direction. So, but it's not a time that we won't reverse course here. We're going to continue to lean into this question. The other thing is we've seen companies collaborating. They've literally cracked the code on this disease by actually learning from one another, not by just working with the competitive instincts that often drive behavior inside companies. So I think it's a fascinating moment for lots of reasons.
You mentioned that we're not going to reverse course on this issue, which I think a lot of people in the stream, I'm sure, are happy to hear. But I want to get your take on we've seen a lot of statements about some of these societal issues that corporations want to fix. They're on LinkedIn, they're off LinkedIn, but a lot of them are just statements so far. So I'm curious from your position what you're looking for in terms of follow through, that we aren't actually reversing course.
I think the follow-up will be seen in the question we were just talking about, for example. What kind of questions will boardrooms take up when it comes to something like contract workers? It's a huge contribution to poverty and inequality. It's a issue that boards have full agency, and executives, it is within their power to decide whether or not to put something out to contract, or whether or not to make it link that job back into the opportunities exist within the firm. It's a choice they're making, and it's rare that you really, we talk about efficiency, but if you're talking about contracting out work, what you're really trying to do is save money. And the question is, are we pricing our products well enough to pay for the real cost? We're all complicit in this. And so, these are complicated questions, but I think that they're going to be front and center.
I certainly hope so. More members are joining us in the stream, Judy. We have Eugene from Chicago, Amy from Washington, Tomas from Mexico, Simon from Canada, and Ahmad from Malaysia. Thanks for joining us on LinkedIn News Live. And Jason says this has to happen, especially for multinational corporations serving the public sector. There has to be more accountability. Speaking of that accountability, you mentioned some of the actions from Walmart, but I'm curious, throughout this pandemic, and even I'm thinking about the protests that we saw on Capitol Hill just a couple weeks ago, what companies you saw doing this right in terms of, just speaking out on these important issues?
Well, I think we saw, there were a host of companies, CEOs of companies who spoke out. The most dramatic statements were linked to whether or not they would continue to fund politicians that they viewed as being on the wrong side of events here. That opens up a lot of questions. And so if there's anything I'm looking for in this moment, is whether or not companies can step back from those kinds of short-term decisions and actually look at the underlying kind of foundation of why they have been putting money into politics to begin with. It's not like you can't be heard if you're a major employer. People want to know what you think. They want to know what's going to help your company be successful over the long haul. But I think money in politics is one of those things that kinds of clouds behavior and maybe is not bringing us to the best result. And so it's back to the foundation of how we make decisions. It's not just the decision in the moment. It's like, what is driving the decision making in a more kind of foundational way?
Well, Judy, you seem like an optimist on most of these issues in terms of we're moving in the right direction when it comes to how corporations are thinking about purpose. But as you look out over the next 10 to 15 years, what keeps you up at night? What work still needs to be done?
Climate. Did I mention climate?
I think you did.
This is it. This is the one. This is the one that keeps me up at night. And we have a historic opportunity. We do have a new administration coming in that's obviously made this a different priority and an opportunity. Also with the Business Roundtable, which landed a phenomenal position statement in the fall that didn't get a lot of attention at the time as we led into the election, but certainly will be revived and put back on the top of the pile soon. So it's first of all, pandemic. We know that that's the president's first priority, but that's the idea that we finally have a united business community that is willing to say that this is a problem that we simply have to address. The uncertainty alone is a major drag on business. We need to put this forward.
I agree, and I can't think of a better note to end on than climate. I think you said it 4 times, climate. Judy Samuelson, thanks so much for joining us on LinkedIn News Live.
Thanks so much for having me. I enjoyed it.
All right, that is Judy Samuelson. She's the author of the new book, The 6 New Rules of Business. As we move into 2021, the coronavirus pandemic continues to have an outsized impact on women. And as we look at the unemployment numbers from December, women, they lost an outsized share of the roles, 140,000 jobs where women experienced losses, and men gained 16,000. So which career paths are opening up opportunities for both men and women right now? Joining me to discuss the latest findings from our Workforce Confidence Report is Senior Editor-at-Large George Anders. George, as always, welcome to LinkedIn News Live. Let's start with the data. You're a data man. How did we measure this? How did we get to this report?
So what we ended up doing here, we'd identified 215 jobs on the rise, all sorts of fields, finance, technology, medicine, where there's growing interest, where there's more hiring. And then we went back and drilled down on that list and we go, okay, let's analyze what the percent of male and non-male people are in each of these fields. And we started looking at the ones that are very close to 50-50. So that's the analysis that we did. And it's a really interesting list of jobs that we've highlighted, everything from loan representatives, mortgage originators, directors of e-commerce, lab associates. So there are a lot of fields that are going close to 50-50. And we could spend a lot of time talking about why that's happening. But I think the first thing to do is just to note that there are a bunch of fields that are no longer seen as predominantly male jobs or predominantly female jobs. They're everybody jobs.
And are there any that particularly struck out to you, something that surprised you in terms of these parity numbers that we're seeing from the report?
So a couple of things that caught my eye. One, there were a lot of them in healthcare, particularly medicine itself. So pathologists, psychiatrists, a whole lot of medicine is now very close to 50-50. And when you roll the clock back and look at what used to be the norm for medical schools, back in the 1960s, only 5% of people going to medical school were female. And that was essentially a man's job, was to be a doctor. And it really took a pioneering woman to try and push through that system. And then that got to 10% in the 70s and 30% in the 80s. And now it's very close to 50-50. So that's a field that a couple generations ago, you would have said that's not a gender equal field at all. And now it is.
This definitely is encouraging news, particularly when we think about how far some of these industries have come. But let's be real here, George. This isn't all good news. As you mentioned in your report, a lot of women aren't making the same as men. Even if they're having the same title on LinkedIn, there's a pay gap there in a lot of these roles. Is that right?
Yeah, that was a surprise for me, and probably, and it's not a surprise at all for people who are working in that field. But if we take something like call centers, there tends to be a difference in the kinds of calls and the kinds of work that get routed to predominantly male call centers versus predominantly female. And the male ones end up getting paid more than the female ones do. So that's obviously an inequity that obviously needs to be addressed. But that's the kind of thing that when you first look at the numbers and you go, oh, call center staffing is about 50-50, you can make the assumption that's a balanced field. And no, there's still imbalances under the surface.
And in terms of best practices, when we think about gender neutral hiring, making sure that our biases aren't creeping in as we're filling some of these roles that may be seen as traditionally male or traditionally female still, what comes to mind in terms of what hiring managers are doing well?
So there's one point that I want to make first, and that is not every field is going to 50-50. And we do have some where elementary school teachers tend to be more than 80% female. People in warehouse management jobs tend to be more than 80% male. And I do see some comments in the response to the story saying, does this mean that everything's going to have to get to 50-50? These are bigger questions than I can answer. And in some cases, the industry dynamics may be such that, we need to process over time and we need to figure out. But there are a lot more fields that getting to a 50-50 balance seems very natural. And I think that's especially true in newer industries. We see it a lot in areas related to tech. User experience is a field that's very close to 50-50. E-commerce is a field that's sitting right at 50-50. And e-commerce, really only got going in the late 1990s, and it's taken off to a much greater degree in the past decade or the past year with the pandemic. We're all sort of ordering our goods from our computers, from our phones, rather than going to physical stores. And when you've got a whole new industry building itself out, you don't have all these legacy issues. It's much easier to go, you know what, we've got good applicants from the female pool, we've got good applicants from the male pool. We don't even think of them as separate pools. We're just looking to hire good people. So that would be an example of one that gets it right.
Certainly these new industries, they don't have the weight of how they hired during legacy periods or the weight of the numbers prior times. But I'm also curious, George, to ask you, do you also think that it's just because these are new exciting industries that more diverse talent is pipelining into, as opposed to some of the more archaic industries that we highlighted in the report?
So that is a really interesting question in the background, is where do people want to work? And when you've got high demand, that tends to make it easier. You're going to get a lot of good qualified candidates that you can hire. And there are some industry where a lot of jobs go unfilled. And that's another issue of what can you do across the board to figure out a way to give each job the dignity and the earning that will make it attractive to people.
George, I'm going to say hello to some members in the stream. We have Barbara in Canada, Bernard in Los Angeles, Anita in Baton Rouge. Thanks for joining us on LinkedIn News Live. We have a question from Kyle. I don't know if Kyle knows this, but this is one of George's expertise. So Kyle, you're in for a treat now. He wants to know, as we come out of this pandemic, will companies retrain their employee base? What are we seeing when it comes to retraining programs?
So retraining is a constant issue, and upskilling. And it may not be so much letting go of your old training as adding to your old training, becoming more effective in the field you're in. We've certainly seen a lot of people who are in hospitality who are looking for ways to reposition their careers, and we've reported on that in the past. There's a lot of training that can be done online now, and that is a big growing area. It's hard to assemble the physical workshop and to get everyone there at the same time. It's a whole lot easier to put out the skills course that people can take on their computer. If they want to do it in the evening, they can do it in the evening. If they want to do it in the morning, they can do it in the morning. So absolutely. I mean, it's an ever-changing world, and we all need to keep sharpening up our skills year by year.
Not to make this too personal, but as you know from your wife's business, EdTech is just booming right now. The investment in that industry is just skyrocketing as we move into 2021.
Yeah, EdTech had a record year for financing. More than $2 billion went into EdTech startups. And the classic issue anytime you're pitching a startup is, what pain point are you addressing in this industry? And for education, the answer is everything's a pain point. It all hurts. So there's a lot of room for newcomers to step in and go, we can do online learning better. We can come up with different ways that people can continue to learn and take advantage of the technology that's here.
All right, George. Well, before I let you go, we mentioned at the top of this segment just the devastating report that we saw from the BLS, where all net jobs lost last month, all the net jobs that were lost were held by women. As we move into 2021, what are you predicting in terms of, and a new presidential administration, I should mention, what are you predicting in terms of how we're going to beat this recovery and get more jobs in the hands of women who just lost so many throughout the pandemic?
So first of all, you're absolutely right. That was a shocking job report, and that's not the kind of thing you can sweep under the table. The one number that I look out and I go, this is actually cause for optimism. America's savings rate last year got up to about 12%. We're not a country of savers. We love to spend. We like that 2-for-1 special. We like that 20% off coupon. And that's a lot of money that is waiting to go into vacations, into clothing, into meals, into entertainment. So I think once we have some level of confidence that we can get out of our homes, the vaccinations have spread to the point where herd immunity is coming close, I would expect to see Americans spend in grand American style, and one person's spending is another person's income. So that's going to create a lot of jobs.
I certainly hope so. And I'm happy to report here on LinkedIn News Live that my parents are getting the vaccine on Monday. So hopefully we're headed towards this new reality that George just discussed. George, as always, thanks for joining us on LinkedIn News Live.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, Caroline.
All right, that was George Anders, Senior Editor at Large for us here at LinkedIn. You can catch the Workforce Report from his profile every Thursday. Tomorrow, my colleague Andrew Seaman will sit down to have a conversation with Amanda Augustine about how to make your resume stand out of the crowd. That's 12 Eastern here on the LinkedIn News page. I'm Caroline Fairchild. Thanks for joining us on LinkedIn News Live.